1920. Beautiful. Well, men, I know it is a privilege to be serving under George A. Custer. I'm also right. I'm just a person just like you, We are gonna make history here today. We are gonna put an end to this native war here. Sir, shouldn't we wait for the reinforcement to get here before we go charging in? Nope. No reinforcements necessary. We have all the men we need. So let's go and take it. Let me just get one more comb in for our victory photo. All right. Looking good. All right. Charge! General George Armstrong Custer is remembered by some as a gallant hero, and by others as a bloodthirsty villain. General Custer was a man full of contradictions and controversy. He was both a lover and a fighter, a brave but reckless warrior, and glory-hungry but disobedient soldier. Custer grew up in Michigan, my home state. He entered West Point Military Academy in 1857, where he was known for spending more time on pranks than on his studies. He was routinely reprimanded for constantly receiving demerits. It was not surprising that he graduated dead last in his class in 1861. Custer graduated from West Point in a country in chaos. The Civil War had just broken out, and Custer saw this as an opportunity for glory. He joined the Union Cavalry, where he attracted the attention of his superiors for his bold leadership style, daring cavalry charges, and tactical brilliance. In June 1863, he became the youngest brigadier general in the Union Army at age 23. He was called the Boy General. Just a few days after his promotion, the Battle of Gettysburg took place, and Custer participated in the fight on the third day of the battle. By the end of the Civil War, Custer, daring and bravery, had earned him another promotion to Major General in charge of the whole cavalry division. Custer was known for leading his men from the front rather than the rear, and he was often the first to charge into battle. General Custer also seemed to have a knack for avoiding injury despite the fact he had 11 of his horses shot out from underneath him. The term Custer's luck was coined to describe his uncanny good fortune. Custer himself was the one to receive General Lee's white flag, signifying his wish to surrender. He was also present for the signing of the terms of surrender in Appomattox. Custer is famously quoted in saying, "I would be willing, yes, glad, to see a battle every day during my life." His life ambition was to gain fame and glory for his battlefield exploits. He was also notoriously flamboyant. He paid special attention to his appearance, especially his long golden hair, which he perfumed with cinnamon oil, and always dressed in the height of fashion, in velvet outfits with gold lace details. In 1866, Custer headed to Kansas to help with the Indian problem. After the Civil War had ended, more land was needed to accommodate American settlers, and as they expanded westward, they inevitably clashed with the local Native American tribes. By the 1860s, most of the local Native Americans had been ruthlessly forced onto reservations or killed. But the Great Plains were the last Native American stronghold, and the Plains Native Americans vowed to avoid a similar fate. Custer participated in a number of raids and battles with the Sioux and the Cheyenne natives over control of the plains. Custer faced two legendary Native American warriors, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, for the first time in 1873, when his unit was protecting a Northern Pacific Railroad at Yellowstone. The government had been encouraging trains to stop so that passengers could hunt the buffalo for sport. The needless slaughter escalated tensions between the Americans and the Native Americans. Although he succeeded in driving them off this time, little did Custer know that he had just faced the two warriors who would bring about his downfall. Custer was learning that fighting Native Americans was much different than fighting Confederate soldiers. The Native Americans had the advantage of being more familiar with the terrain, and since they were fighting to preserve their way of life, they were much more motivated to fight to the bitter end than Custer's career soldiers. In 1868, South Dakota's Black Hills had been set aside for the Great Sioux Reservation. However, once gold was discovered in the hills, the government quickly went back on their deal and took over the land. Custer was tasked with relocating the Native Americans to their new reservation, but things didn't exactly go as planned. Rather than going quietly, most Native Americans traveled to the banks of the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana to join Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse to fight for their freedom. On June 25, 1876, Custer was one of the first to arrive at the meeting point near the Native American encampment, where he and the other generals planned to gather to find out the Native Americans' location and force them to surrender. While waiting for the other generals to arrive, Custer decided that his men will move in and surround the Native Americans before waiting for his reinforcements. No one is quite sure why he thought this was a good idea, but based on what we know about him, we can assume that arrogance and glory-seeking played a big role in him leading his men to certain death. The battle famously came to be called Custer's Last Stand, but the Native Americans will call it the Battle of Greasy Grass. The arrogant general never stood a chance against such a mighty force of Native American warriors. Once it became obvious that they were not only outnumbered, but outgunned. With more than 2,000 warriors, this was the largest gathering of Native Americans ever seen on the Great Plains. The Native Americans also had superior repeating rifles and bows and arrows, while the cavalry only had single-shot rifles. Overwhelmed by the Native Americans' superior firepower, Custer's command collapsed completely, and it quickly became every man for himself. Within an hour, the Native Americans were victorious over every single one of Custer's 210 men. Custer himself was found dead along with his men, including 2 of his brothers and brother-in-law. The Battle of Little Bighorn was the U.S.'s biggest military defeat. The Native Americans' victory was short-lived as the American public demanded retribution for the death of Custer. Although the Native Americans won the battle, Little Bighorn was the decisive moment when it became clear they would lose the war. The U.S. Army intensified their efforts to hunt down the Native Americans and either relocate them or wipe them out completely. Facing unprecedented violence against his people, Crazy Horse finally surrendered in 1877, bringing the Plains Indians Wars to a close. On reservations, life was designed to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man. Entire generations of children starting as young as 4 years old were sent away to boarding schools, threatening their parents if they didn't send their children there, food rations would not be given to them. At the schools, their hair is cut short, and they are forbidden from speaking their tribal language. They were not training them for high education, but for how to be maids or maintenance workers. They were training them to be un-Indian as possible. It was a cultural genocide. Meanwhile, Custer's legacy lived on as Buffalo Bill would reenact The Last Stand in his Wild West show, using real Native Americans who actually took part in the battle. Future President Ronald Reagan played Custer in a film, Santa Fe's Trail. Custer himself had written his autobiography shortly before his death, and it became a bestseller. Today, the American public is beginning to acknowledge that perhaps Custer wasn't the flawless hero he had been made out to be. While his heroism might be up to debate in modern times, his legend certainly lives on, and we suspect that the flamboyant glory monger wouldn't have it any other way.
There were 1,000 Indians standing on the riverbank. 200 cavalry waited there with pride. And I saw Chief Crazy Horse, leader of the Indians, old General Custer with his musket by his side. Then Crazy Horse started things with a yell that shattered the quiet of the early morn. General Custer gave out a mighty, mighty roar, and they met at the little Bighorn. There were muskets, arrows, cannonballs a-flying, yelling, screaming, a lot of men were dying.